1 out of every 12 Americans suffers from severe depression on a daily basis. Not only that, but in the U.S., every 12.8 minutes, someone dies from suicide. But there is hope. Studies also show that religious faith is a very important factor in preventing suicide. And that is why we're excited to have a guest with us this morning, Dr. Karen Mason. Dr. Mason is a professor of counseling and psychology at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. She's a licensed counselor and psychologist and has been working in the mental health field since 1990. She recently wrote a book called Preventing Suicide. This book is a great handbook for pastors, for counselors, and for any of us who have a friend who's thinking about ending it all. So would you please give a warm BlackRock welcome to Dr. Karen Mason.
Dr. Karen Mason, and she has given me and all of us the honor of calling her Karen. And so, Karen, we welcome you here to BlackRock. And just referring to your book there, it's called Preventing Suicide, a guide to pastors and chaplains and other professionals. But I've read this book, and it is truly just a very practical, easy to understand guide for any Christ follower who is looking to help people who are hurting in this area. Just with regard to this book, what led you to write it?
Well, first, thanks so much for your warm welcome, Pastor Steve, and to BlackRock Church. And, you know, I think I probably started thinking about the book when I was managing the Office of Suicide Prevention at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And during that time, we were developing materials to send out to different groups, different professionals like primary care physicians and school counselors and home health aides. And in the national strategy, the Suicide Prevention National Strategy, it actually talks about just the key role of faith leaders and faith communities. And I wasn't really sure what materials we should be sending out to faith leaders and faith communities. So when I had a chance to come teach at Gordon-Conwell, I was saying to myself, that's what I want to try to figure out. And the book really has come out of that. It has come out of just the realization of how comprehensively faith leaders and faith communities engage this issue of suicide.
So churches have a big role to play, both in reaching those who are part of the congregation, but also our entire community. And we at BlackRock, we want to be part of that, bringing health to our community in this way. But in order for us to be involved in prevention and intervention and postvention regard to suicide, we need to get beyond some of the myths surrounding this topic. And so let's go over those myths, and maybe you can help us, Karen, with this. The first myth has to do with the fact that there are those who mistakenly believe that what we're doing here is dangerous. By talking directly about suicide, the myth is that, well, now you're planting ideas in people. And that can also happen to us on a friend basis, where we can see friends who are struggling, who are at risk, and we won't talk about it because we think that by talking directly, we're actually triggering a potential act. And this is a myth. Could you just speak to this?
Well, there's just a ton of research out there, and really good research. If you're into randomized control trials, there's really good research to suggest that talking about suicide does not distress people, does not plant the idea in their mind. People who take surveys about suicide don't all of a sudden start thinking about suicide. And here's kind of the practical aspect of that. So, you know, when we were in elementary school, we all learned stop, drop, and roll for fire safety, right? But none of us, we never had a unit on what to do if you have suicidal thinking. And so a lot of times when suicidal thinking happens, It's very distressing. It can be puzzling. It can be scary. It can even be embarrassing. And we don't really know how to start that conversation with somebody else. Hey, I'm having thoughts of suicide. So if someone comes to us and says, hey, things have been really difficult for you, you look really down, or, things are really different for you right now, are you having thoughts of suicide? Just asking that question can feel like a relief to the person who is thinking about suicide, because all of a sudden they realize, hey, here's a person who cares, here's a person who's going to be safe, to whom I can talk about these particular issues. But one of the sort of other pieces I'll just add to this is that it is important to ask the question directly, are you having thoughts of suicide or thoughts of death? Because if you were to ask the question, are you planning to not be around next week? Well, somebody might be planning to travel. So it's better to just ask directly.
Right. So I think that's a lesson to all of us, that the stakes are just too high here to just parse words. We need to talk directly to people if we think they're at some sort of risk, and ask them directly about what they're struggling with. All right, that's the first myth. The second myth has to do with self-harm, and whether that automatically brings a person into a suicidal context. Let's say I have a friend who is cutting herself or burning herself, or I have a friend who uses alcohol in a life-threatening way, drinking himself to passing out on a regular basis. These are destructive acts of self-harm, but they're not necessarily in the suicide category. Could you just explain this differentiation of self-harm?
Right. So people who self-harm, some of those folks might overlap with the group of people who are thinking about suicide, but there are people who self-harm who aren't thinking about suicide. And so it's important to think about those two things a little bit differently. Some of the people who self-harm might go on to think about suicide, but not all of those folks will. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't take harm seriously, self-harm seriously. People who self-harm can accidentally really harm themselves, and some of those people might get used to pain, might habituate themselves to pain, and then that opens the door to the possibility of a suicide attempt. So we still want to take it seriously, even though it might not overlap exactly with people who are thinking about suicide. But Dr. Matthew Knock from Harvard has, in his research, has found there's many reasons why a person might think about self-harm. One is just to feel something. Some people just don't feel anything inside, and so at least to feel something is better than nothing. Some people feel intense distress, and to feel pain and maybe the endorphin rush might be better than feeling the intense distress they're experiencing. Some people might self-harm to get people's attention around them, and some people might self-harm to influence behavior, like get my parents off my back. Other researchers have found that it might be the result of modeling. They see other people doing it, or just an intense self-hatred. So there's just a number of reasons why a person might self-harm.
Okay, so this again speaks to the fact that we need to be direct, and that if we hear someone who is talking about cutting or burning or something like this, that then the follow-up is not to assume, but to ask some direct questions. Here's another myth that is very important to us as a church, and we're in a series, I Have a Friend Who, which is a device related to the fact that there are some things in church that believers feel very reluctant to own themselves, and so they'll say instead, I have this friend who. Well, there's a myth out there that says that Christ followers, true Christ followers, never commit suicide, never consider suicide or get depressed to that extent. That's a myth. Could you speak to that as you work with many believers who struggle in this area?
Absolutely. So even in the Bible, we have Moses and Elijah and Jonah who expressed a wish for death. We have people like the famous evangelist Charles Haddon Spurgeon, who told his congregation about his depression. And we have Edward J. Carnell, former Fuller Seminary president, who wrote about his suicidal thinking. So certainly we have examples of people throughout the ages who have who are God-fearing people, Christ followers even, who have struggled with suicidal thinking. But if we think about this theologically, it makes sense because as Christ followers, we're both redeemed and fallen, right? We still struggle with sin, and we struggle with the brokenness of this world that we were born into. And one of the pieces of that is struggling with mental health, vulnerabilities to suicide, all kinds of things like that. So in 1 John 1:8, we read, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. We do struggle with brokenness. Another reason could be that Satan seeks to destroy Christ followers. So the Puritans really emphasize this, that their fellow Puritans who are struggling with suicidal thinking, that was the devil who was, as we read in 1 Peter 5, was prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And I think another reason that occurs to me that I've seen a lot working with people is just that as Christians, as Christ followers, sometimes we cope in Christian ways and sometimes we cope in non-Christian ways. So the sort of quintessential example for me is Job's wife, who in the middle of Job's and her suffering, she said in Job 2, curse God and die. Another example would be William Cowper, who wrote many hymns, who attempted suicide several times because he just couldn't understand that God could forgive him. So certainly as Christians, sometimes we struggle with really understanding the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think because of that, sometimes people do struggle with suicidal thinking. And I think lastly, on this side of heaven, our bodily weaknesses sometimes do overcome our spiritual desires. And we read in Romans 8, we groan inwardly, waiting for the redemption of our bodies. We're waiting to be released from this brokenness that we're all experiencing.
Thank you. And I think the bottom line is, again, for us, Black Rock, that we can be honest about our struggles, and that this is a place, as believers in Jesus, who's the truth, we should make this place where we worship together and we fellowship together a place where we can be truthful about all struggles, including this struggle that we're discussing today. All right, one more myth, and this is the myth that has to do with the face of suicide. I'm speaking for most people now, but I think most people, when they think of the problem of suicide in our culture, think of a young person, and maybe even like a teenage girl. And obviously, teenage girls are as much at risk as anyone else, but this stereotype, I think, also obscures some victims that we can often miss or not be looking for. Could you help us in this area?
Sure. So, sorry to bring charts to church.
Sure.
But if you look at these are data from 2016 from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the left-hand chart is non-fatal self-harm, which is basically suicide attempts. And these are attempts that have been treated at a hospital. So certainly these numbers are underrepresented. And then on the right, we have suicide deaths, which again are no doubt underrepresented because they are reported by medical examiners and coroners who sometimes, perhaps family members, encourage them not to report them as a suicide. So to read the chart, though, you want to look at the bottom line there, the x-axis, which is age ranges. So each little clump of bars represents a different age range. So that first age range is 10 years old to 14 years old. The next age range is 15 years old to 19 years old. So one of the things that you can see if you're looking at it, the green bar is the total numbers. either suicide attempts or suicide deaths. The green bars is total numbers, the red bars are female, and the blue bars are male. So one of the things you're going to notice is that certainly when it comes to suicide attempts, that's why we usually put that female face on suicide, because there are more numbers. But as you were just pointing out, Pastor Steve, really it's a phenomenon that exists much more broadly than in that young age range. And certainly you can see there are a few of those age ranges where in fact there are more males who have attempted suicide than females. And then when we move over to suicide deaths, one of the important things to notice is that the higher numbers really are males. So males are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than females. And again, we don't want to, as you were pointing out, obscure the fact that females do die. But at the same time, different ages and different genders are going to be experiencing this issue of suicide differently.
That's good. That's helpful. And again, I think the idea is, again, that all demographics are struggling with suicide, but we want to make sure that we're not missing some people, maybe even white, middle-aged men who may not self-identify, may not talk about it a lot, but we need to be able to draw out and be aware of that risk.
Right. Males have a tendency to be to seek services less, and we certainly need to encourage that.
All right, so now we all have people in our lives who are depressed, who may even say something regarding self-harm, and we want to be better equipped to offer help to hurting people in our lives. So can you help us in this process of trying to assess a person as whether they are low risk or if they're high risk or they're moving toward high risk? What are some things that we can be watching for or asking in that regard?
And it's so important what you just said, that there is that continuum of risk. And I think it's helpful to think about markers along the way, along that continuum of risk. So the markers that I think of are ideation, thinking about suicide. And a question could be, you know, are you thinking about suicide? Have you thought about that? Intent, do you intend to follow through on those thoughts? Because not all people who have those thoughts intend to follow through on them, right? But then have you thought about a plan? Have you thought about how you would follow through on those thoughts? That's another marker further along that continuum. And then do you have the means? Do you have the capability of following through on that plan a little farther along that continuum? And then last would be, you know, are you imminently at risk? Are you thinking about in the very near future following through on that plan? And I think somebody over here on that continuum is that this is very serious, and this person really ought to be evaluated at a hospital emergency room. So I think that's one of the things that's important. But there are, all along that continuum, you know, medium risk, as you were pointing out, and lower risk, where we still want to take that seriously, but at the same time, there is that continuum. And if you're struggling to try to figure out where on that continuum is this person, one of the resources that I think is important to point out is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK. And the person who's experiencing suicidal thinking can call, but a helper could call too, or you could call together and try to really think about where on this continuum is this person.
Because that's a 24-hour...
24/7.
And it's local people who answer the phone.
That's right.
And it's something that you can ask questions regarding someone else you love.
That's
and
right.
Get some good information.
That's right. And there's a network of 160 crisis centers across the United States, and so you are going to be able to find out about your local resources.
Great. Okay. So we've talked about high risk. Let's go back to low risk. And the truth is that there are people listening to us right now who have suicidal thoughts. And we would love to offer them something even right now in terms of what is a guide that we can give them in terms of addressing their need in this area.
Well, one of the things that would be a positive piece is just thinking about seeking mental health services if you are experiencing suicidal thinking. But another possibility, two possibilities I'd like to mention. One is a safety plan and one is a hope kit. So let me tell you about both of those. So a safety plan is a short, easy to read plan that a person wants to have accessible to themselves when those suicidal thoughts occur. It's kind of like a life jacket that's going to keep you afloat in the midst of that suicidal thinking, and it's something that's going to interrupt that continuum, that suicide continuum. And usually safety plans include calming type activities, some ways to manage the distress that you're experiencing, and also social supports that you want to reach out to. So calming activities can be, and again, another reason why faith communities are so important here is your faith, right? Prayer and listening to music that reminds you. I was thinking as I was listening to the music today, how wonderful that the music is in terms of reminding us of God's love for each one of us. So it can be calming kind of activities like that, taking a walk, petting your dog, all kinds of things like that. But then social supports, people that you can reach out to. And again, another reason why faith communities are so important. A lot of these people are going to be in your faith community, right? The pastor, the youth pastor, the Sunday school teacher, somebody in your small group, somebody that you can reach out to. That would be what would go into a safety plan. And you can see one of the pieces in the safety plan is Get Out My Hope Kit.
Yeah, what's
so
a hope
let me
kit?
tell you about a hope kit. So a hope kit is a tangible collection of reasons to live. It's things that are meaningful to me, that help motivate me to choose life, because a part of me wants to die, but a part of me wants to find a way through these difficult circumstances to be able to continue to live. So these tangible things are going to be different for everybody. It can be photographs of something or someone who represents hope for you. But as an example, one woman took T-shirts from all the people who were very meaningful to her and made a quilt. And every time she had those suicidal thoughts, she would get out that quilt and be reminded of her reasons to live. Right. And I should also mention, some people now, there are a lot of great phone apps that are virtual hope boxes. So a lot of different, it has to be tailor-made to the individual, but a lot of different possibilities there.
I love that image of the quilt and just wrapping yourself up in the love of others. And certainly that's what we have as believers. As believers, we have resources that other people do not have, and that we can wrap ourselves in our relationship with the one who loves us more than we can ever even imagine. And we can talk to God and listen to God in prayer. We can turn to God's word in Scripture and find true hope there. And then there's the fellowship that we have together, and then also the opportunities to serve and to find meaning in serving. And we should all be finding that kind of hope as we follow Jesus. But going back to truth, and particularly that in Scripture, what would you put in your hope kit when it comes to God's Word?
Loved you asking me that question as we were talking through the interview. So I have a few verses up here, some of my favorite verses, but I'm just going to talk about 3 and 4, the third one and the fourth one. So the third one is a verse from Acts 16 where Paul and Silas just got put in jail. They got just thrown in jail in Philippi. And miraculously, God intervenes and an earthquake happens and all the prisoners are freed. And somehow Paul knows that the jailer is about to kill himself.
Because he's responsible for
He's
all
responsible
these, right.
for these prisoners and knows that he's going to be executed anyway, so why not take care of this? But in just an extraordinary act of suicide prevention, Paul calls out to the jailer and says, "Don't harm yourself, we're all here." And many people have said, Paul is giving the jailer a reason to live, and I agree. The fact that the prisoners are still there is a reason to live. But I think it's bigger than that. I think what is extraordinary for me is that even the life of a jailer is important to save. I think that the unshakable value of every human life is what I get from that verse in Acts 16, and that is so powerful to me. Just extraordinary how Paul intervened in the life of this lowly jailer who jailed him. Right. And then the fourth one I just want to mention, really probably one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It's Genesis 50:20. So Joseph's brothers are coming to him and saying, "Joseph, you're going to have to forgive us for having done all those awful, horrible things to you." And Joseph says to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And what really hits me is that the God who redeemed me through the death of Jesus Christ on the cross also redeems Joseph's suffering, and he redeems my suffering. And it's not to say that what happened to Joseph is right, because it was wrong what happened to Joseph. And what happens to me sometimes is wrong. God is a God of justice, and he cares about that. But what I think is so powerful is that God is able to take this brokenness and redeem it into something so powerful, like the saving of a whole family's lives.
Right. And you're referring there to the truth in the Bible that suffering is real, that we don't need to candy coat this, and we know that some of you listening now are suffering, but that there is hope in Jesus in the midst of your suffering, and that the God of the impossible can give you what seems impossible in your life right now, and that's true hope.
Absolutely.
So we're needing to come to the end here, but maybe could you give a final word just to us as a whole church as we seek to grow in this area and to be more aware and to talk more about it, but also we know that you're also speaking to people who are helpers of those who are hurting. And there are people even who have loved ones who are struggling with this right now and on a daily basis. What could you say in the word of an encouragement to us all here today?
Yes. So I was going to say just a lot of great resources. If you want to go to the next slide, here in Connecticut, lots of wonderful resources. PreventSuicideCT.org, a lot of resources in terms of materials you can order and trainings and that sort of thing. Local resources as well. But in terms of helpers, I think one of the things that's so important is to get educated, and that's what I'm so appreciative of what you're doing here, Pastor Steve. I just think it's so important to get educated about some of these issues so that you can sort of negotiate some of the challenges of mental health conditions and treatments. Treatments are available, treatments are good, but how do you negotiate this? How do you coordinate care well? But one of the things I would say to helpers and caregivers is that they are not exempt from the fourth commandment. God rested when he finished his work. They need to find ways to balance out the fact that they are engaging human suffering in very profound ways. So helpers also need to find ways to take care of themselves in order to avoid burnout. And that's another thing that's protective, I think, about a faith community, is that we as a church need to come around these helpers who are frontline caregivers and give them the ministry of presence and the ministry of helps.
That's excellent. Thank you. I so appreciate you being here to help us here at Black Rock. I know you do too. Would you just join me in thanking Karen Mason? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We want to thank you for watching and listening to our sermons online, and we hope that you will be inspired to live more like Jesus through these. Please check out blackrock.org for more information about our church. Know that you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, and also know that you can give to Black Rock and to our ministry through PushPay, through our mobile app, and on our website. Your donations and your support of our ministry allows us to have these videos online and for us to impact our community.